What if everything you believed about your family's poverty was actually a carefully orchestrated lie? What if the struggle that defined your entire existence was stolen from you by blood relatives who saw you as nothing more than an obstacle to their greed? For Rebecca Carter, a 28-year-old bartender barely surviving on tips and ramen noodles, that devastating revelation came disguised as a routine Thursday evening at the exclusive Platinum Lounge. For Alexander Thornfield, the pharmaceutical mogul whose patents had saved millions while making him billions, it was the moment his perfectly controlled world began to crumble. She was just mixing drinks for wealthy patrons who treated her like furniture. He was just another billionaire seeking refuge in the club's private sanctuary. But when Rebecca spotted the distinctive pocket watch chain glinting from his vest, identical to the one her late father had treasured above all else, a casual comment would unleash a storm that had been brewing for 25 years. This isn't a story about mistaken identity. This is about how one woman's desperate quest for answers exposed a conspiracy so methodical, so ruthlessly executed, that it had buried an entire generation's birthright beneath layers of forged documents and manufactured shame. But one Thursday night, a single pocket watch would change everything. The Platinum Lounge existed in a realm where ordinary rules didn't apply. Located on the 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower, it commanded a view of the glittering cityscape that made even billionaires pause in reverence. Crystal chandeliers imported from Venice cast rainbow shadows across marble floors quarried from Italian mountains, while men in $1,000 suits discussed deals that could reshape entire industries over cognac that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. Rebecca Carter moved through this gilded maze like a ghost, her black uniform marking her as part of the invisible army that kept the wealthy comfortable. The dress code was strict: black silk blouse, tailored black skirt, hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, minimal jewelry. She had learned to make herself as unremarkable as possible, to blend into the expensive wallpaper until summoned to perform her function. At 28, Rebecca had mastered the art of existing without being seen. Her auburn hair gleamed under the crystal lights, but she kept her gaze downcast, her movements economical and silent as she crafted perfect cocktails for clients who barely acknowledged her presence. She could prepare a dozen different classic drinks without thinking, her hands steady even when her heart was breaking from the endless reminders of everything she'd never have. The Platinum Lounge paid well, 3 times what she could make anywhere else, but it came at the cost of her dignity. Every shift was a masterclass in humiliation. Listening to men casually discuss spending on art or wine, what would have paid her father's medical bills 10 times over. She endured it because she had to. Every paycheck went toward the crushing debt Michael Carter had left behind when cancer finally claimed him 3 years ago. Her father had been a proud man, working double shifts at Morrison Manufacturing his entire adult life. He'd risen from floor worker to shift supervisor through sheer determination, always promising Rebecca that things would get better, that their luck would turn. He'd spoken often of his family's better days, of a time when the Carters had meant something in the city, though he'd never provided specifics. "We had money once, Becca," he'd tell her during his final months, fingering the golden pocket watch chain that never left his vest. Real money, enough to matter. But when she'd pressed for details, his eyes would grow distant and pained, as if remembering required more strength than he possessed. The medical bills had been catastrophic. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments had consumed their savings, and then some. Rebecca had dropped out of college in her junior year to work full-time, watching her dreams of becoming a teacher evaporate like morning mist. She'd sold everything of value except her father's watch and chain. Those were sacred, untouchable reminders of the man who'd raised her alone after her mother's death when Rebecca was 12. Tonight, the Platinum Lounge hummed with its usual collection of titans and tycoons. Rebecca recognized most of the regulars by now. The oil baron, who tipped in hundreds but never said thank you. The tech mogul who treated every interaction like a hostile takeover. The pharmaceutical executive who commanded respect through sheer presence alone. In the club's most exclusive alcove, separated from the main floor by etched glass panels, sat a man who commanded attention without seeking it. Alexander Thornfield, CEO of Thornfield Pharmaceuticals, was perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and penetrating green eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. His navy suit was cut with surgical precision, the fabric so fine it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore his immense wealth like armor, impenetrable and intimidating. Rebecca had served him exactly 3 times before, always the same routine. He would arrive at 8:30 precisely, request the corner booth, and order a single malt scotch. Macallan 25, neat, no ice, no water. He would nurse the drink for exactly 1 hour while reading financial reports on a tablet that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He tipped precisely 25%, left at 9:30 on the dot, and never made eye contact with the staff. To Alexander Thornfield, service workers were simply another piece of the club's expensive machinery, necessary but invisible, functional but forgettable. Rebecca had perfected the art of serving him without disrupting his routine, appearing when needed and vanishing when not, like a well-trained ghost. Tonight felt different, though she couldn't identify why. Perhaps it was the way Thornfield kept glancing at his phone, his usually perfect composure showing hairline cracks. Or maybe it was the tension she sensed in the room's other patrons, hushed conversations about FDA investigations and congressional hearings that seemed to revolve around pharmaceutical companies. As she approached his table with the familiar amber liquid, something metallic caught her attention in the soft lighting. A gold pocket watch chain stretched across his vest, disappearing into a small pocket at his waistband. But it wasn't just any chain. It was an intricate piece of craftsmanship, with tiny mechanical gears etched along its length in microscopic detail. Most striking of all was the fob. A distinctive compass rose with 8 perfectly pointed rays, each point tipped with what looked like a tiny diamond. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The chain was identical, absolutely, impossibly identical, to the one currently locked in her safety deposit box at First National Bank. Her father's chain, the one he'd worn every day of his adult life, bore the same golden links, the same microscopic gear engravings. The same compass rose with its 8 diamond-tipped rays. The similarity was so precise, so utterly complete, that for a moment Rebecca wondered if she was losing her mind. But no, she'd examined her father's chain countless times, memorizing every detail during those long hospital nights when sleep wouldn't come. This wasn't similar. This was identical. "You're Scotch, Mr. Thornfield," she managed, her voice barely steady as she set the glass down with trembling hands. He glanced up from his tablet, annoyance flickering across his aristocratic features at the slight tremor in her tone. "Is something wrong, miss?" He paused, realizing he'd never bothered to learn her name, despite months of service. "Carter," she supplied automatically. "Rebecca Carter. And I'm sorry, sir, but that watch chain. My father had one exactly like it." Alexander Thornfield went completely still, every muscle in his body suddenly rigid. His fingers instinctively moved to the chain, as if protecting it from some invisible threat. For a heartbeat, something flickered across his perfectly controlled features. Not surprise, but something deeper and infinitely more dangerous. Fear. "That's not possible," he said, his cultured voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The tablet forgotten, his full attention was now focused on Rebecca with laser-like intensity. "This chain has been in my family for 4 generations. It was commissioned specifically for my great-grandfather in 1895. There is no other." Rebecca's heart pounded against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. The club's ambient noise, crystal clinking, muted conversations, the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers, seemed to fade into white noise. "But, sir, I know every detail of my father's chain," she insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. The tiny gear patterns along the links, the compass rose with the diamond points, even the inscription on the back of the fob. Thornfield's knuckles whitened around his glass. "What inscription?" "Apus revelat veritatem," Rebecca said, the Latin phrase rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "Time reveals truth. My father taught it to me when I was little." The glass slipped from Alexander Thornfield's grasp, expensive crystal exploding against the marble floor like a small bomb. The sharp crack cut through the lounge's genteel atmosphere, drawing startled looks from nearby patrons. Several heads turned toward their alcove, curiosity evident on faces accustomed to absolute discretion. "Time reveals truth," he repeated, the ancient Latin phrase falling from his lips like a confession. His face had gone pale, the carefully maintained composure of a lifetime beginning to crack. Rebecca stared at him, confusion and fear warring in her chest. She'd expected him to dismiss her, to call security, to treat her like the delusional employee she must seem. Instead, he looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost. "Sir, did you know my father?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander Thornfield stood slowly, his movements mechanical and distant. The commanding presence that had intimidated boardrooms and world leaders seemed to drain from him, leaving behind someone who looked suddenly devastatingly vulnerable. He pulled his wallet from his jacket. Italian leather, she noted absently, probably worth more than her monthly salary, and extracted $500 bills, dropping them beside the crystal shards. It was more than she made in 2 weeks, but it felt like blood money. "We need to speak," he said, his voice hollow with some unnamed dread. "Not here, tomorrow, 3 o'clock. He paused, his green eyes boring into hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Thornfield Tower. Tell security you have an appointment with me personally. Ask for the private elevator to the penthouse." He started to walk away, then stopped, turning back with visible effort. "And Miss Carter, bring your father's chain. Bring everything he left you. Every document, every photograph, every piece of his history you possess." He walked away without another word, leaving Rebecca standing among the glittering debris of broken crystal, her world tilting dangerously off its axis. Around her, the Platinum Lounge continued its elegant dance of wealth and power, but she felt as if she'd just witnessed the first tremor of an earthquake that would reshape everything. The ride home on the subway felt surreal. Rebecca sat in the fluorescent-lit car, surrounded by late-night workers and partygoers, trying to process what had just occurred. A billionaire, one of the most powerful men in the pharmaceutical industry, had reacted to her father's pocket watch chain as if it contained the secrets to his own destruction. Her small studio apartment in Brooklyn felt even more cramped than usual after the opulent grandeur of the Platinum Lounge. The contrast was jarring, from crystal chandeliers to a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, from marble floors to worn linoleum that had seen better decades. She'd grown accustomed to moving between these two worlds, but tonight the transition felt like falling from heaven into purgatory. Rebecca made herself a cup of instant coffee. The good stuff was a luxury she couldn't afford, and sat on her threadbare couch, staring at the framed photograph of her father on the end table. Michael Carter smiled back at her, wearing his best suit and the golden chain that had somehow connected their modest life to the rarefied world of Alexander Thornfield. She'd never really questioned her father's stories about their family's past prosperity. Every working-class family had such tales, legends of better times, of money lost to bad investments or cruel circumstances. She'd assumed his were just another version of the American dream deferred, the kind of wishful thinking that helped people cope with lives that hadn't turned out as planned. Now, staring at his face, she wondered what secrets had died with him. What truth had he carried to the grave, too painful or too dangerous to share with his daughter? Unable to sleep, Rebecca spent the night researching everything she could find about the Thornfield family and their pharmaceutical empire. What she discovered painted a picture of wealth and power that stretched back over a century. The company had been founded in 1895 by Edmund Thornfield I, a brilliant chemist who'd made his fortune developing new manufacturing processes for medicines. His son, Edmund II, had expanded the business internationally, while Edmund III had navigated the company through the Depression and both World Wars. The current Alexander Thornfield was Edmund IV, fourth generation of a dynasty built on innovation and ruthless business acumen. But as Rebecca dug deeper, she found gaps in the family history that seemed deliberately obscured. References to other family members, brothers, cousins, business partners, that appeared in early records but vanished from later accounts. It was as if entire branches of the Thornfield family tree had been systematically pruned away. Most intriguing of all was a brief mention in a 1920s business journal of the Carter-Thornfield partnership that revolutionized pharmaceutical manufacturing. The article was fragmentary, but it suggested that the Thornfield fortune hadn't been built by one man alone. There had been a partner, someone whose contribution had been significant enough to warrant equal billing in the company name. But by the 1930s, all references to any Carter involvement had disappeared from the company's official history. It was as if an entire partnership had been erased from existence. The next afternoon, Rebecca stood before the gleaming monolith that was Thornfield Tower, clutching a worn leather satchel that contained everything her father had left her. The building was a testament to corporate power, 60 floors of steel and glass that seemed to scrape the belly of the clouds themselves. She'd walked past it countless times over the years, never imagining she'd have reason to enter its marble lobby. Security was more intimidating than she'd expected. Men in expensive suits, with earpieces and the kind of alertness that suggested military backgrounds. When she mentioned her appointment with Alexander Thornfield, their demeanor changed instantly. She was escorted to a private elevator she hadn't even noticed, hidden behind what looked like decorative paneling. The ride to the penthouse seemed to last forever, carrying her up through layers of corporate hierarchy, each floor representing another level of wealth and influence she'd never imagined she'd experience. When the doors finally opened, Rebecca stepped into a world that redefined her understanding of luxury. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor, a shrine to corporate power with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city spreading out like a vast circuit board below. Original paintings hung on walls that probably cost more than most people's houses. She recognized a Monet, a Picasso, what might have been a Van Gogh. Sculptures that belonged in museums were casually placed throughout the space like expensive furniture. Behind a desk that could have served as a landing strip for small aircraft, Alexander Thornfield waited. But he wasn't alone. An elegant woman in her 70s sat rigidly in one of the leather chairs arranged before the massive desk, her silver hair arranged in a perfect chignon that probably required daily professional maintenance. Her pale blue Chanel suit spoke of old money and older secrets, while diamond earrings caught the afternoon light like captured stars. This was Eleanor Thornfield, Alexander's mother and the current chairman of the company's board of directors. Beside her stood a younger man, perhaps 45, with Alexander's same penetrating green eyes, but a face that had been softened by years of privilege. His expensive suit couldn't quite hide the slight paunch of someone who'd never known physical labor, and his manicured hands had never been calloused. This had to be Marcus Thornfield, Alexander's younger brother, and the company's chief financial officer. "Rebecca Carter," Alexander said as she entered, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming. This is my mother, Eleanor Thornfield, and my younger brother, Marcus." Eleanor's gaze was Arctic steel, the kind of look that had probably reduced corporate rivals to quivering submission. "So you're the young woman making these extraordinary claims?" "I haven't claimed anything extraordinary," Rebecca said, her working-class directness cutting through the room's refined atmosphere like a knife through silk. "I just mentioned a watch chain that looked like my father's." "A watch chain that belongs to this family," Marcus interjected. his voice carrying the subtle condescension of someone who'd never been challenged by anyone outside his economic class. "Whatever game you're playing, whatever angle you're working, I can assure you it won't succeed. We have the best lawyers in the city. I'm not playing any game," Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a bartender who noticed something familiar. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why." Alexander held up a hand for silence, though his eyes never left Rebecca's face. "Show us what you brought." With hands that trembled despite her best efforts at composure, Rebecca opened the leather satchel and began removing its contents. First came a small velvet box, the kind used for precious jewelry. Inside, nestled on faded satin, lay a pocket watch chain identical to the one Alexander wore. Even in the office's sophisticated lighting, the chain seemed to glow with inner fire. The gold had aged to a warm honey color, but the intricate gear patterns etched along each link were still clearly visible. At the end of the chain hung the compass rose, its 8 diamond-tipped points catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the desk's polished surface. Eleanor Thornfield's composure cracked visibly, a sharp intake of breath, her pale hands gripping the chair arms until her knuckles went white as bone. "How did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I told you," Rebecca said, confusion evident in her tone. "My father gave it to me before he died. He said it had been in our family for generations." "Your father," Eleanor said, the words dropping like stones into still water, "was David Carter." Rebecca frowned. "No, ma'am. My father was Michael Carter. He worked at Morrison Manufacturing for 32 years. "Michael Carter was the name he took," Alexander said quietly, his voice heavy with some burden Rebecca couldn't identify. "But he was born David Carter. David Carter was my father's younger brother." The room spun around Rebecca. She gripped the back of the nearest chair to steady herself, the chain swinging from her nerveless fingers like a golden pendulum marking the seconds of her disbelief. "That's impossible," she managed through numb lips. "My father was poor. He worked in a factory his whole life. He died drowning in medical debt. You're saying he was related to this?" She gestured helplessly at the opulent office, the priceless art, the view that literally looked down on the entire city. "Because we made him poor," Marcus said with casual cruelty, as if discussing the weather. "Because he was a threat to everything we built. Because he refused to know his place." "Marcus!" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip, but the damage was done. The truth hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unmistakable. Alexander moved to the massive windows, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid with tension. "David Carter was my uncle," he said quietly, his words barely carrying across the space. "My father Edmund's younger brother and business partner. When my grandfather died in 1954, David should have inherited half of everything." Rebecca's legs gave out entirely. She collapsed into the leather chair, the chain clutched against her chest like a lifeline in a storm. "You stole his inheritance." "We protected the family legacy," Eleanor said, her voice taking on the defensive edge of someone who'd rehearsed these justifications for decades. "David was unstable. Alcohol problems, gambling debts, unsuitable romantic associations. The company would have been destroyed in his hands. So you destroyed him instead," Rebecca whispered, pieces of her father's broken life finally making terrible sense. The long silences when she'd asked about family, the way he'd flinch whenever someone mentioned success or money, the drinking that had started after her mother's death and never really stopped. "We offered him a settlement," Marcus added, his tone suggesting he considered this generous beyond measure. A monthly stipend that would have kept him comfortable for life. All he had to do was sign away his claims and agree never to contact the family again. He chose pride over pragmatism. "You forced him to choose between dignity and survival," Rebecca shot back, her voice rising with each word. "And when he wouldn't sell his birthright for whatever scraps you offered, you made sure he'd never be able to claim what was rightfully his." She thought of her father's struggles, the way doors had mysteriously closed whenever he'd tried to better their situation. Promotions that had gone to less qualified candidates. Loans denied despite stellar credit. Job opportunities that had evaporated without explanation. "You didn't just take his money," she said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "You sabotaged his entire life. You made sure he could never rise above poverty, never accumulate enough resources to challenge you." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor and Marcus exchanged worried glances, their carefully maintained facades showing cracks. Alexander continued staring out at the city his family owned, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Rebecca reached into her satchel again, pulling out a manila folder stuffed with documents. "I brought everything," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Every paper, every photograph, every record my father kept." She spread the contents across Alexander's desk. Faded birth certificates, employment records, medical documents, and photographs spanning decades. At the center of it all was an old black-and-white photo showing two young men in their 20s, both handsome and proud, standing before a building with Carter Thornfield Chemical Solutions painted on the window. Alexander turned from the window, drawn by some invisible force to the photograph. His face went completely white as he recognized the building, the original Thornfield Pharmaceuticals factory. "That's your grandfather," Rebecca said, pointing to the taller of the two men. "Edmund Thornfield III. And that's my grandfather, standing right beside him as an equal partner." She pulled out another document, this one typed on official letterhead. The original partnership agreement dated 1924. Carter Thornfield Pharmaceuticals, with ownership split 50-50 between the families. Eleanor's face had gone ashen. "Where did you get these?" "My father kept everything," Rebecca said. "Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence that proved what you'd stolen from him. He never gave up hope that someday, somehow, justice would be done." She pulled out the final item, a handwritten letter, the paper yellow with age. "This is the letter your father sent to mine in 1955, 1 year after your grandfather died. The letter where he offered David $10,000 to disappear forever." Alexander took the letter with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. His father's words, preserved in black ink, documented the exact terms of David Carter's exile, $10,000, a promise never to contact the family again, and a threat of legal action if he ever tried to claim his inheritance. $10,000, Rebecca said, her voice thick with disgust. "For half of what's now a $12 billion empire. That's what you thought my grandfather's birthright was worth." "The company wasn't worth anything close to that in 1955, Marcus protested weakly. "Because you made sure it wasn't," Rebecca countered. "Because you forced him out before the real growth began. Before the patents he'd helped develop made you rich beyond imagination." She stood up, slipping the chain back into its box. "You have two choices. You can give me the truth, all of it, everything you did to my father and grandfather, or I can take these documents to every newspaper, every regulatory agency, every competitor you have. I'll make sure the whole world knows how the Thornfield Empire was really built." Eleanor found her voice, cold and sharp as winter steel. "You're making a grave mistake, young lady. The truth you're seeking is more complex than you can possibly imagine. There are things about your father, about your family, that you don't understand." "Then explain them to me," Rebecca demanded. Marcus stepped forward, his earlier condescension replaced by something darker. "Your precious father wasn't the innocent victim you think he was. David Carter was a drunk, a gambler, and worse. He would have destroyed everything our family built through 3 generations of hard work." "Hard work?" Rebecca laughed, a harsh sound in the refined space. "You mean the hard work of stealing other people's ideas? Of crushing anyone who threatened your monopoly on the Carter Thornfield legacy?" "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Eleanor said, her voice deadly quiet. "This family has survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and countless attempts to destroy us. We did what was necessary to protect what we built." "You built it on my family's foundation," Rebecca replied. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." She gathered the documents back into their folder, her movements deliberate and controlled. 48 hours, she said as she headed for the door. 48 hours to decide whether you want to tell the truth voluntarily or have it dragged out of you in court. "Rebecca," Alexander called as she reached the elevator. She turned back to see him standing at his office door, no longer the commanding CEO, but a man wrestling with decades of buried guilt. "Your father, David, he tried to contact me once, about 15 years ago. I was young, stupid, afraid of my mother's disapproval. I had security throw him out." His voice broke slightly. "I've regretted it every day since." Rebecca studied his face, seeing genuine pain in his green eyes. "Then you know what you have to do." The elevator doors closed, carrying her back down through the layers of wealth and power. But Rebecca Carter was no longer the same woman who'd entered Thornfield Tower. She was no longer just a bartender struggling to survive. She was the granddaughter of a man who'd been cheated out of an empire, the daughter of a man who'd been systematically destroyed for refusing to surrender his birthright. And she was going to make sure the whole world knew their story. 3 days of intensive investigation with the help of a private detective named Jake Morrison revealed a conspiracy so vast and methodical it left Rebecca physically ill. Her father hadn't just been cheated out of an inheritance. He'd been the victim of a decades-long campaign of systematic persecution orchestrated by people who shared his blood. Morrison was an ex-cop who'd built a reputation taking on cases the police wouldn't touch. He worked out of a cramped office above a deli, but his connections throughout the city ran deep. Within 48 hours, he'd uncovered a pattern of sabotage that stretched back nearly 30 years. "They were thorough," Morrison said, spreading documents across his cluttered desk. "Whoever orchestrated this had serious resources and no conscience whatsoever." The evidence was damning. Employment records showed that every job David Carter had applied for between 1955 and 1985 had been sabotaged through anonymous phone calls to HR departments. Credit reports revealed mysterious negative marks that appeared whenever he tried to secure loans or mortgages. Medical records from 3 different hospitals showed identical patterns of administrative errors that had inflated his bills beyond any reasonable amount. Most chilling of all was a series of private investigator reports commissioned by Eleanor Thornfield between 1960 and 1995, detailing every aspect of David Carter's life. The surveillance had been comprehensive: where he worked, where he lived, who he associated with, even which doctors he visited. It was the kind of monitoring usually reserved for foreign spies or organized crime figures. "Look at this," Morrison said, pointing to a report dated 1987. "Your father applied for a supervisor position at Morrison Manufacturing, ironically the same company where he eventually worked. He was the most qualified candidate, but 3 days before the interview, the hiring manager received an anonymous tip claiming David had a gambling problem and outstanding debts." Rebecca stared at the document, her hands clenching into fists. "None of that was true. My father rarely gambled, and he was obsessive about paying his bills on time." "Doesn't matter," Morrison replied grimly. "The damage was done. The job went to someone else, and your father never knew why. This pattern repeated dozens of times over the years. But the most devastating discovery came when Morrison accessed court records from 1963. David Carter had actually filed a lawsuit against Thornfield Pharmaceuticals, claiming his rightful inheritance as Edmund Thornfield III's business partner and heir. The case had been dismissed after David failed to appear for critical hearings. "Here's the thing," Morrison said, pulling out a hospital record dated the same month as the missed hearings. "Your father was in Riverside Psychiatric Hospital during this entire period. Involuntary commitment, signed by Eleanor Thornfield as his next of kin." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. "She had him committed?" "For 8 months, Morrison confirmed. "The medical records show he was subjected to experimental treatments, electroshock therapy, drug trials, procedures that would be considered torture by today's standards. When he was finally released, his lawsuit had been dismissed and his legal rights had been signed away by his guardian. The records painted a picture of systematic psychological torture. David Carter had entered the hospital as a man fighting for his inheritance and emerged as a broken shell, too traumatized and medicated to challenge the people who'd destroyed him. "They didn't just steal from him," Rebecca said, her voice hollow with rage and grief. "They broke his mind," Morrison nodded grimly. "And it gets worse. After his release, they had him declared mentally incompetent. Eleanor Thornfield became his legal guardian, controlling every aspect of his life. The monthly payments Marcus mentioned, those were administered through a trust that kept him barely above poverty level, while ensuring he could never accumulate enough resources to fight back." Rebecca thought of her father's final years. The way he'd sometimes stare into space for hours, lost in memories too painful to share. The nightmares that had plagued him, the medication he'd taken for anxiety that had made him docile and compliant. "I need a lawyer," she said, her voice steady despite the tsunami of rage building inside her chest. "Someone who isn't afraid of going after people with unlimited resources." Morrison smiled grimly. "I know just the person." The law offices of Catherine Wu and Associates occupied half a floor of a downtown building that had seen better decades, but the reception area hummed with purposeful activity. Wu herself was a small, fierce woman in her 40s, who'd built her reputation taking on corporate giants and winning. Her walls were covered with newspaper clippings documenting victories against oil companies, pharmaceutical corporations, and government agencies. She listened to Rebecca's story with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining a patient, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed a mind like a steel trap. When Rebecca finished, Wu leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "They made mistakes," she said finally. "Arrogant, sloppy mistakes that are going to cost them everything they own." She stood and moved to a whiteboard, began sketching out a legal strategy that took Rebecca's breath away. Criminal charges first: conspiracy, fraud, racketeering under the RICO statute, and possibly kidnapping for the involuntary commitment. The psychiatric torture alone could result in life sentences. Wu turned to face Rebecca, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "But the civil case is where we'll really destroy them. Wrongful imprisonment, systematic harassment, theft of inheritance, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We'll go after their personal assets, their corporate holdings, their reputation, everything. I don't want to destroy them," Rebecca said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if that was true. "I just want justice for my father." Wu's smile was sharp as a blade. "Rebecca, justice and destruction are going to be the same thing. When we're done with the Thornfield family, they'll be lucky if they can afford a studio apartment in Queens." The first shot was fired not in court, but through a coordinated media blitz that Wu orchestrated with surgical precision. She had contacts at every major newspaper and television station, journalists who specialized in exposing corporate corruption and governmental cover-ups. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, across every major news outlet simultaneously. "Pharmaceutical dynasty built on stolen fortune," screamed the headlines. "Billionaire family's systematic torture of rightful heir exposed," declared the evening broadcasts. The evidence Wu released was comprehensive and devastating. Hospital records showing David Carter's involuntary commitment and experimental treatment. Employment records documenting decades of sabotage. Financial documents proving the systematic theft of his inheritance. Most damning of all were the private investigator reports, showing 30 years of surveillance and harassment ordered by Eleanor Thornfield herself. Social media exploded with outrage as the details spread worldwide. Justice for David Carter began trending within hours. Protesters gathered outside Thornfield Pharmaceuticals headquarters, demanding Eleanor Thornfield's arrest. Congressional representatives called for investigations into pharmaceutical industry practices. The company's stock price collapsed in a single day, wiping out billions in market capitalization. International regulators announced reviews of Thornfield patents and business practices. Medical journals published editorials questioning the ethics of treatments developed through such systematic cruelty. By Thursday, Eleanor Thornfield was under federal investigation. By Friday, Marcus had been arrested on charges of conspiracy and fraud. The empire built on David Carter's stolen birthright was crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Alexander Thornfield appeared at Rebecca's apartment on a rainy Saturday morning, looking like a man who'd aged decades in a single week. Gone was the commanding presence that had intimidated boardrooms across the globe. In his place stood a broken individual carrying the crushing weight of his family's sins. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. Rebecca stepped aside, her small studio apartment suddenly feeling even more cramped and shabby with his presence. He looked around at her second-hand furniture, the stack of medical bills still on her counter despite the legal settlement offers that had begun arriving. The framed photograph of her father in his factory uniform occupying the place of honor on her mantel. "That's him," Alexander said, moving to the photograph with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. "David, Uncle David, you remember him?" Alexander nodded slowly, his green eyes distant with memory. "I was 15 when he disappeared from our lives. Before that, he was my hero, everything my father wasn't. Edmund IV was cold, calculating, always focused on business and profit margins. But David had time for a confused teenager. He taught me to throw a baseball, helped me with my chemistry homework, told me stories about the early days of the company." His voice broke slightly. "He used to say that the company belonged to both our families, that someday I'd help him run it as partners, the way it was meant to be. I worshipped him. What happened?" Rebecca asked, though she thought she already knew. "My mother poisoned me against him," Alexander said, his voice heavy with decades of suppressed guilt. "After he disappeared, she told me he'd had a breakdown, that he'd become dangerous and unstable. She said he'd tried to steal company secrets to sell to competitors, that he was a drunk and a gambler who couldn't be trusted around family." He moved to Rebecca's small window, staring out at the rain-soaked street below. "I believed every word. I was 15, grieving my grandfather's death, and my mother was all I had left. When she told me David had been committed for everyone's safety, I felt relieved, grateful that she'd protected us from this dangerous man who'd once been my hero. But you knew the truth eventually," Rebecca said. Alexander nodded slowly, pieces of it over the years. "When I turned 21 and gained access to family documents, I found things that didn't match my mother's stories. Partnership agreements that showed David as an equal owner, not an employee. Medical records that documented treatments no sane person would authorize for someone they claimed to love." He turned back to face her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "By the time I understood what had really happened, I was already complicit. The company I was running was built on his stolen work. Every dollar I spent was taken from him, from you. I told myself it was too late to change anything, that exposing the truth would destroy innocent people who worked for us." "Innocent people," Rebecca repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "I know how it sounds," Alexander said quickly, "but Thornfield Pharmaceuticals employs over 50,000 people worldwide. We develop medicines that save lives, fund research that could cure diseases. I convinced myself that preserving the company was more important than correcting ancient wrongs." "Ancient wrongs?" Rebecca's voice rose dangerously. "My father died 3 years ago, drowning in medical debt because of what your family did to him. Those aren't ancient wrongs, they're ongoing crimes." Alexander flinched as if she'd struck him. "You're right, absolutely right. I used the greater good as an excuse to avoid confronting my own cowardice." He pulled a thick envelope from his coat, placing it carefully on her small kitchen table. "Everything, every document, every record, every piece of evidence showing what we did to David, including some things your lawyer hasn't found yet." Rebecca stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Why are you doing this? Because I can't live with it anymore, he said simply. Because David deserved better than what we gave him. Because you deserve the truth, no matter how much it destroys my family. She opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding documents that painted an even more horrific picture than she'd imagined. Medical experiment records showing David had been used as a test subject for psychiatric drugs that were later banned. Financial records proving Eleanor had systematically drained David's trust fund to pay for her own luxuries. Most damning of all, a series of letters between Eleanor and Marcus discussing David's final solution, a plan to have him declared permanently incompetent and institutionalized for life. They were going to put him away forever, Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. The only thing that saved him was the new patient rights laws passed in the early 70s, Alexander confirmed. They had to release him, but they made sure he was too broken to ever threaten them again. Rebecca looked up at him through her tears. There's something else you're not telling me. Alexander's composure finally cracked completely. The night before David was committed, he came to our house. I was there. I heard everything. He wasn't ranting or delusional, like my mother claimed later. He was calm, rational, begging my father to honor their partnership agreement. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My father laughed at him, said the agreement was worthless because it had been signed by a mental defective who couldn't manage his own affairs. David tried to show him the watch chain, said it proved their family connection, their shared legacy. What did your father do? He ripped it from David's hands, Alexander said, the words coming out like confessions at gunpoint. Said it belonged to the real Thornfield heir, not some bastard pretender. That's when David broke down, when he started screaming about justice and family honor. That's when my mother called the psychiatric emergency team. The picture was complete now, the final piece of a puzzle that revealed the full scope of the Thornfield family's cruelty. They hadn't just stolen David's inheritance. They'd systematically destroyed his mind, his identity, his connection to the family legacy he'd helped build. I was 15, Alexander repeated, as if the words could absolve decades of complicity. I didn't understand what I was witnessing until it was too late to stop it. Rebecca wiped her eyes, her grief hardening into something colder and more dangerous. It was never too late. You could have spoken up at any point in the last 35 years. You chose not to. I know, he admitted. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. He moved toward the door, then paused. There's something else you should know. The watch chain, it wasn't just a family heirloom. According to the original partnership agreement, whoever holds both chains has controlling interest in the company. Your father's chain, combined with the legal documents you now possess, makes you the majority owner of Thornfield Pharmaceuticals. Rebecca stared at him. I'm saying you don't just have a claim to compensation. You have a claim to ownership. Everything my family built, everything we stole, it all belongs to you. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the city clean as Rebecca contemplated a reversal of fortune so complete it defied belief. The bartender who'd served drinks to men who owned the world was about to become one of those owners herself. But first, there would be a reckoning. The boardroom of Thornfield Pharmaceuticals had hosted some of the most important business meetings in the industry's history. Deals worth billions had been struck across its mahogany table under the stern gaze of portraits depicting 4 generations of Thornfield leaders. Today, it would witness the fall of the dynasty those portraits represented. Federal marshals flanked Eleanor Thornfield as she sat in handcuffs, her perfect composure finally shattered beyond repair. Marcus slouched beside her, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in federal custody. Their lawyers, the best money could buy, looked like men preparing for a losing battle. At the head of the table sat Rebecca Carter, no longer the invisible bartender, but the rightful heir to an empire built on her family's stolen legacy. She wore a simple black dress and her father's pocket watch chain. The compass rose, catching the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Catherine Wu sat beside her, organizing documents with the methodical precision of a surgeon, preparing for a complex operation. Across from them, federal prosecutors laid out evidence that would send the Thornfield matriarch to prison for the rest of her life. "Mrs. Thornfield," U.S. Attorney General Patricia Hayes began, her voice cutting through the boardroom's expensive silence, "you are charged with conspiracy, racketeering, fraud, kidnapping, and 47 counts of systematic harassment spanning 3 decades. How do you plead?" Eleanor raised her head, her pale blue eyes blazing with unrepentant fury. "Not guilty to all charges. David Carter was a mentally unstable man who posed a threat to this company and everyone associated with it. Everything we did was necessary to protect legitimate business interests." Legitimate. Rebecca's voice cut across the room like a whip. "You had my grandfather tortured in a psychiatric hospital. You subjected him to experimental drugs that destroyed his mind. You stole his inheritance and spent 30 years ensuring he could never reclaim it." Eleanor turned to face her. And for a moment, the mask of civilization slipped away entirely, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Your grandfather was weak. Your father was weak. This company requires strength, vision, the ability to make hard choices. Your bloodline lacks those qualities." "My bloodline built this company," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "Every patent, every innovation, every breakthrough that made you rich, half of it came from Carter minds and Carter hands." She stood, moving to the wall, where the portraits of past Thornfield leaders hung in gilded frames. "Where's my grandfather's portrait? Where's David Carter's recognition for the work he did, the partnership he honored, the legacy he helped create?" Marcus found his voice, though it came out as a whine. "The company was failing when David was involved. Father saved it by taking decisive action. Your father saved it by stealing everything that wasn't nailed down," Wu interjected, consulting her notes. "The patents filed in Edmund Thornfield III's name between 1955 and 1970. 70% of them were based on research David Carter conducted before his illegal commitment. Your family built their fortune by plagiarizing a man they'd driven insane." The prosecutors presented their case with methodical thoroughness. Bank records showing systematic embezzlement of David's trust fund. Medical records documenting experimental treatments that violated every ethical standard. Surveillance reports detailing 30 years of harassment and sabotage. Most damning of all was a series of recorded conversations between Eleanor and Marcus, obtained through a wiretap authorized after Alexander's testimony to federal investigators. The recordings captured them discussing David's disposal and their plans to ensure Rebecca never learned the truth about her heritage. The defendant clearly viewed David Carter not as a victim deserving compassion, but as a problem requiring elimination, Prosecutor Hayes stated. "These recordings demonstrate a callous disregard for human life that continued for over 3 decades. When the evidence presentation concluded, Eleanor was given one final opportunity to speak. She stood slowly, her handcuffs forcing her to maintain a dignified posture that couldn't hide the defeat in her eyes. "I spent 50 years building and protecting this company," she said, her voice carrying across the silent boardroom. "We made hard choices, unpopular choices, necessary choices. David Carter would have destroyed everything through his weakness and instability. I saved thousands of jobs, funded life-saving research, contributed billions to medical advancement." She looked directly at Rebecca, her gaze unwavering. "History will vindicate my actions. This company will outlive all of us, and that legacy matters more than one man's hurt feelings." Rebecca stood to respond, the weight of 4 generations pressing down on her shoulders. "Mrs. Thornfield, you're right about one thing. This company will outlive all of us.